what's the value to our business to getting CBPR certification? And I can tell you the fact that it is underpinned by the regulatory frameworks and the regulators and the authorities at a national level, the presence and the participation and the commitment and the buy-in by regulatory bodies is priceless if you think about it. I mean, the fact that these are endorsed programs by basically who you're accountable to in these various jurisdictions stands for a lot. And so if you're trying to do an internal sell, right, whether it's to your risk team or to your, your compliance team, to your internal audit, to whatever it might be, I think we really need to understand that at the end of the day, the value and the impact certainly outweigh any kind of costs of certification.
Welcome to Privacy in Practice, the podcast where we bring you the latest insights, practical solutions, and real-world stories from the world of data protection and privacy. I'm Kellie Dupree.
And I'm Danie Strachan. Privacy in Practice is brought to you by VeriSafe, your trusted partner in privacy and data protection. In this podcast, we dig into the challenges and opportunities in privacy compliance, from navigating complex regulations to building a sustainable privacy program that works for your business, not against it.
So let's jump in and get practical with privacy. Today, we are very excited to welcome Charmian Aw, one of the leading voices in the Asia-Pacific region on data, privacy, and cybersecurity, to the podcast. Widely recognized across major legal directories, including Chambers, Legal 500, and Global Data Review, Charmian has earned a reputation as a trusted advisor to global organizations navigating regulatory, transactional, and compliance challenges in an integrated global world.
Charmian is a partner at Hogan Lovells, where she leads on cutting-edge matters spanning data and AI governance and cross-border data transfers. Over her impressive career, she's spearheaded large-scale compliance projects across more than 130 jurisdictions and has helped hundreds of organizations manage investigations, data breaches, and emerging regulatory challenges across industries, from technology and healthcare to finance and gaming.
But today, we are going to dig into a very specific topic with Charmian. We're going to take advantage of her front seat in the evolving world of the global CBPR program. We'll hear her thoughts about emerging macro trends and the possible future world where privacy-first principles and regulator-backed partnerships enable a simplified and predictable world of data transfers. Welcome, Charmian.
Thanks very much, Kellie. It's great to be here.
Charmian, we're so excited to have you here. I've really been looking forward to this episode since meeting you in Singapore a while back. You've advised organizations across more than 130 jurisdictions on privacy and cybersecurity. That's an extraordinary breadth. If you could go back in time now, what is there that you know now that you'd like to tell your junior lawyer self back then?
Sure, that's a great question, Danie. A good way to tee us up for the rest of the conversation, which I also am very excited about. But before I answer the question head on, I wanted to just talk about that 130 countries because I think it's bare mentioning that the world is ultimately very much interconnected. When we advise clients, we don't look at, just, states in isolation or singular sort of, nations and regulations in their sort of standalone form. We're really looking at, a very large geography, right, that they operate in. And I think this will really set the stage and set the scene for what we have to discuss with regards to the challenges that they're grappling with being so international. And so with that, I will now answer your question. And I would say that, the funny thing is, I don't think I would have very much to say to my younger self, except to just, I think, have more trust in the process and just to have a bit more like self-belief, because I was very much an anxious, young lawyer, eager to prove herself. Whatever you will make of that. But I think that the truth is that every little obstacle or challenge that I've come across has actually, in a way, molded that journey or the experience, which has led me to where I am today. So actually, even if something was a bit trying, it was actually like a huge blessing in disguise. I know it's cliche, but it is very true. And who knew what the world would be like, X number of years later? We look at what was happening now with AI, etc. I mean, I don't think my younger self would even have fathomed that we would be where we are today.
Amazing. I love that answer, Charmian. I think many of us started out as very anxious, in my case, people-pleasing lawyers, and it's lovely to know that it's going to be okay, and you do have to trust the process. I think it's a great answer. I also loved your answer about the 130 countries, because that is indeed exactly what we want to talk about today. So we want to talk about a program that we think is a little underhyped, if you will, in America in particular, where a lot of our clients are based. And it is a growing program, a program that's been around for a while. Current iterations sort of are evolving. But the ultimate dream, perhaps you might say, of this program is to allow data transfers freely between a very large global, even number of countries. And I think if we also asked, maybe perhaps in the future, if we come back now and ask our now lawyer selves, like, hey, which problem would you wish we had solved for you? We might well say data transfers and the 200-page contracts we're now negotiating involving the SCCs and all the other things. And perhaps this program could someday evolve to be the answer to that problem. And that program is the CBPR. So, Charmian, what is the CBPR?
Yeah, just before that, right, Kelly, I think, the whole thing about it being under height, let's spend like a minute or so just addressing that, right? Why it's under height. I think, I've been following the APEC CBPR, now the global CBPR, for a while, and I have been advising, numerous clients, both controllers and processors, and even did, several, sort of memos on uh, I guess the cost benefit analysis of getting certification under the CBPR scheme. And I would say that the reason I think why there is an underhype, as you put it, is because we start with the wrong why. Meaning, we often look at the CBPR as kind of a sort of, oh, it's good to have, but it's not necessary. And, I think the whole compliance conversation should actually be shifting rapidly, especially with what's happening with AI. In the past, we used to ask ourselves, what do we have to do? What do we need to do? What is strictly required by law? And then the GDPR didn't help that conversation, because the GDPR came in and said, well, this is what happens if you don't comply. 4% annual turnover, huge sanctions, huge, sort of geographical, breadth in Europe, the European Union. And that was in a way, the scare factor, right? That led a lot of compliance teams and certainly legal counsels and clients to then craft their compliance programs around the requirements and the mandatory obligations that underpin the GDPR as we know it today. But that is not sustainable, and it's also not a very scalable or progressive way of looking at what's happening. As you rightly put it, Kelly, what we are trying to solve for is actually the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, businesses are global. They are globalized, whether we like it or not. The practical realities of business today is that, apart from the politics and sort of all the, kind of the rhetoric, right, that is frankly sometimes driven by geopolitical kind of considerations or agendas, the truth is businesses will always be global, will always be international. Your entire supply chain will always involve some other part of the globe. And so what happens is you will need to transfer data across borders. And state laws are state specific, as we know. So it's the certification program solves for these numerous challenges that businesses are grappling with. So I think you have to start with the why, and then we move into what the program is. And actually, the way I see it is that it is essentially a multi-stakeholder unified framework. At the moment, it is voluntary, which, by the way, again, right, adds to the underhype. Because like I said, you start with the why. The minute you say voluntary, some people switch off because they're like, okay, it's not mandatory. We don't have to comply. We don't need to have it. But again, right, it's the starting point because if you think about the why, if you're already having to comply with so many disparate laws, it's becoming more of a patchwork, not less. Plus, you have scale. Plus, you have the fact that actually it's extremely progressive. It helps you do your business sustainably and forward looking, meaning once you have undertaken the certification with the program, you actually are able to continually do business in multiple jurisdictions in a compliant manner, right? And it doesn't really cost very much more, and I'm happy to share a bit more, but maybe I'll pause there because what I wanted to go more into, right, Danie and Kellie, is really the constraints of some of the alternatives we're looking at, right? And I'm very familiar with this because we do this well all the time for clients where they say, we operate in, a dozen countries. So tell us, how do we comply with all the dozen laws that apply to us, right? But I'm going to pause there. Back to you to kind of, let me know if that's kind of answered your question. And we can go into further detail.
That's excellent, Charmian. I think it's really useful to understand why to do this. I really like that. I think in many aspects of life, it's always it's always important to understand why you're doing something. And also for people that are listening to this podcast, it's important to understand that motivation so that they can explain this to their internal stakeholders, because they might have to motivate for CBPR certification on their sides as well. Before we go deeper, and I really want to go deeper, and I'm sort of have to rein myself in here because you've gone a long way already now to try and explain to us the value of the system. But let's maybe just pause and explain the basics. So CBPR stands for Cross-Border Privacy Rules. And then there's also the PRPs, and we'll get to them a little bit later. Can you maybe just mention to us, so you're based in Singapore, so you obviously advise a lot of clients in Singapore, but we've heard in lots of other jurisdictions as well. But for which countries at the moment would you suggest this? Which countries are participating in the CBPRs? And I think many people know that there are the APEC CBPRs and then there are the global ones. But let's first just start with which countries are currently participating in and what is the difference, if any, between the APEC CBPRs and the global ones.
I love that. And actually, that is an important distinction, Danie. So it started off as the APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation CBPR, right? So APEC, as we know, Asia Pacific. So everything from Asia and the Pacific. And that was basically two, right? Basically across the Pacific Ocean, you have those sorts of countries in scope. And that was obviously the past sort of framework. But we have now moved on. And I think, frankly, it does actually mirror the fact that now we have the word global in the name of this forum, because I think it was just off the back of the recent workshop in Boracay, the Philippines. The Dubai International Financial Center announced that they were a full member as well. So obviously Dubai is in the Middle East, it's not in APEC, etc. But also we are seeing other jurisdictions and parts of the world joining as either associate members or full members. A non-exhaustive list would be, we have Nigeria, we have Mauritius, we have the UK. So I'm basically giving you a sampling. And by the way, I actually think that the momentum that we have going will likely lead to more members and literally around the globe. Of course, I can't speak on behalf of anyone, but it's no secret that, for example, India has just kind of had its DPDPA come into force just yesterday. We see very promising activity in Malaysia, etc. So I really do think that this is going to really kind of circle the globe. But I think also another healthy statistic that shows we're headed in the right direction is the number of entities that are currently benefiting from certification, 2,000 globally. And I think this number will pick up. I think that we will hit a tipping point, I suspect, when we have enough processes, right, Danie? You mentioned the PRPs, for example, where you have the processes being the intermediaries that support the controllers. And by the way, it becomes a bit of a what do they call it? It's kind of like a symbiotic relationship where when you become a processor that is certified, the controllers rely on that certification in their procurement processes, for example, and vice versa, where suddenly controllers can no longer not be certified because, say, their competitors are. So I think there will become this sort of network effects, right? If we are, we're sensing the right direction of travel with this forum. But another thing I wanted to mention just off the back of Boracay is that we see the regulators lending support. And this is a very important part of the forum, right? And how it will take on a successful form this time around, right? As opposed to the APEC of the past form live in, because you do need regulatory support in the sense that the authorities need to really lend their firepower to making this scheme something that either, their local regulations, their domestic laws actually sort of say, okay, by being certified, you then comply with, I don't know, some transfer limitation obligation or some cross-border transfer rules that domestic laws require you to align with, right? And also there's a lot of kind of like co-learning and collaboration and cooperation between and amongst regulators around the world. So with that kind of regulator support, I do think it's a matter of time that the organizations, right, whose jurisdiction they come under, will also start looking at this certification scheme as one of the ways, one of the mechanisms that they can go about complying, right, with local requirements.
I want to pick up on your point about the 2,000 companies. I think that may not sound like it is a lot. It also may not sound like a lot. But I think if you look at which companies those are, Cisco, Coca-Cola, Box, Cloudflare, Twilio, IBM, Mastercard, Alibaba, Cloud, Byte Plus. There's a whole bunch of really big companies that you might think of as, oh, that's interesting. Why are they spending time on this? And it's not. We haven't really talked about the mechanics of certifying, which I definitely think we should get to shortly. But it's not it's not an insurmountable process. Just because those are huge name companies doesn't mean that this is only for big companies. I think rather they're sort of indicators of where they can kind of see how this is going. They probably have the most pain points as a large global organization, to your point, Charmian, about supply chains and just, needing data to transfer in order to make their business work. And so they've sort of seen the value in this. And I think that's another nice indicator. Do we actually want to talk logistics quickly? So let's say you're convinced that this is interesting and you want to know more about it. Danie, do you want to speak a little bit about how you apply, what the logistics are for considering this certification?
So the important thing to realize is in order to apply for certification, you need to apply in the country where you're established, obviously. So to do that, you have to approach what is known as an accountability agent. So VeriSafe is an accountability agent. The accountability agent is basically an assessor or an auditor, and its job is to check whether you're complying with all the various principles that underpin these systems. So very shortly, if you're applying, you'll have to complete a questionnaire, and that questionnaire will then unpack and discover whether you're complying with all of these principles. The accountability agent then checks your compliance. They look at your answers. They might ask a couple of questions if some things seem missing or something doesn't make sense. Part of the role of the accountability agent is to point out those gaps, if there are gaps, so that the applicant can close out those gaps. And then if everything has been closed out, then essentially you're certified, you can be listed, and then every year you have to renew. So there is this recertification and there's ongoing monitoring. But it's not a super complicated process. Obviously, there's work that goes into it, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But you have to have a certain level of readiness in order to apply for certification. If you don't have a privacy notice yet, it's maybe too soon to apply for CBPR. certification. So you have to make sure that some essential building blocks are already in place before you apply for certification. But it's and I think that also speaks to some of the advantages of the CBPRs, because they help you to make sure that your privacy program is running properly, that you have the right things in place. You're not just focusing on one aspect, but you have to make sure that you have a holistic privacy program in order to obtain this certification. Charmian, I'd like you to maybe just explain one other concept you mentioned earlier. We've been talking about the PRPs. What is the difference between CBPR and PRP before we go any further?
I will certainly address that, Danie. But before that, could we just give a shout out to whoever came up with that actually brilliantly coined term accountability agent when you were talking about it? That actually, at the end of the day, it literally is what it says. It's you have essentially an agent that helps you come into accountability. So the whole program is designed to aid and to support you rather than to become kind of an, I mean, I don't know. Okay, maybe I should be careful what I say, but we do have a lot of misconceptions about an auditor or an audit, right? Where it's like, oh, it's so invasive. And basically auditors tend to be quite unpopular. But actually that's not, I mean, the methodology may be similar, but at the end of the day, if really you need to come to accountability, or you should come to accountability to reduce risk and et cetera, why wouldn't you have an accountability agent also endorsed by the forum and by the authorities, right? Including the in the country of the establishment, right? So I think that actually this role that you play um is a very well considered and beneficial one to organizations looking to get certification. But that aside, coming back to your point, CVPR and PLP, what is the difference? Well, actually, methodology is very similar. They both will go through the same kind of questionnaire. It's a different questionnaire for processors and controllers, but in terms of actually being assessed, the process is very similar. Now, the question is, right? I guess the million-dollar question is, which one do you go for? And should you go for both, right? So I would advise any organization um, as to really the kind of role they play in their business, right? So are they purely a sort of, we are just a CRM provider, and we act for a lot of companies in these jurisdictions where the CBPR, where they of the CBPR, and so that makes sense for them maybe to consider the PRP first and foremost. But that is not to say, right? Please don't get me wrong. But that is not to say that they shouldn't also consider CBPR certification. Why do I say that? Because, I mean, ultimately, they will have employees, in certain offices. And actually, the truth is data, whether it's an employee sort of setting, right? And, sort of employee data, prospects, etc., and or customer consumer data, they may also consider the CBPR. And actually, if I want to be really kind of pragmatic or kind of just quite like commercial about it, it actually is quite good value for money to kind of apply for both. Because like I said, right, it comes back to my earlier point, the assessment is you have to go through the assessment anyway. So why not get your entire house in order rather than just the master bedroom, right? Ignoring the rest of the. So it's like kind of like, I think like at the end of the day, of course, it's on a case by case basis, but I would say that it's not mutually exclusive, and I do see a big business case for having certifications in the both PRP and CBPR for some organizations.
Can I talk a little bit about the Venn diagram of overlap, or the flower Venn diagram of overlap between the DPF certification, ISO 27001, SOC 2, GDPR, and the CBPR PRPs? And I think that also is an important point. I think as you say, auditing sounds scary, but this program overlaps a lot, not completely, with all of those things that I just mentioned. I've actually got our processor spreadsheet questionnaire pulled up. And so, some of the questions are going to sound very familiar to people, like, do you have a process in place to notify the controller of occurrences of a breach, a data breach, basically? I'll not read the whole question. Has your organization implemented procedures for the secure disposal or return of personal information when instructed by the controller, right? I mean, I think a lot of these, they overlap. And so I think as you're considering this or pitching this, I've heard some people sort of use this as a stepping stone towards ISO or SOC 2 certification. It's sort of, if that's something that's in your company's goal, these things certainly align. If you're already done a lot of work, as Danie mentioned, you're not starting over. A lot of these things overlap. And also that commercial value you're talking about, Charmian, knowing that this has been audited and this has been verified, especially I think for processors, but for controllers as well. It's like a very, I think it can be a very helpful thing and exercise to do.
I agree, Kellie. I think there are synergies and alignment in one regard. And by the way, this is not an original thought. Harvey Zhang from Cisco shared this at the Boracay Forum. He said, actually all it takes is for companies to start considering adding global CBPRs in their procurement checklist. That will move the needle quite a bit. But at the same time, Kellie, I would say that, again, not trying to kind of like oversell it, but I do think that the CBPR has certain added advantages over and above other certifications we're seeing in the market. Of course, I can't comment on cost, right? Because that's always going to be kind of and this is one of the business considerations, granted. But what I mean by sidestepping the whole, people always ask, oh, but what is the ROI on the cost? And actually, the ROI is on impact and value rather than just a dollar amount, right? Like how much is the ISO certification going to cost us versus global CBPR? And that's not the conversation we should be having. Rather, what is the value to our business to getting CBPR certification? And I can tell you the fact that it is underpinned by the regulatory frameworks and the regulators and the authorities at a national level, because I mean, when I went to the Boracay Forum, I attended the Singapore one earlier as well, because we had 2 fora every year. The presence and the participation and the commitment and the buy-in by regulatory bodies is priceless if you think about it. I mean, the fact that these are endorsed programs by basically who you're accountable to in these various jurisdictions stands for a lot. And so if you're trying to do an internal sell, right, whether it's to your risk team or to your compliance team, to your internal audit, to whatever it might be, I think we really need to understand that at the end of the day, the value and the impact certainly outweigh any kind of costs of certification, right? So again, I do think that there needs to be a context to everything that we speak about. And the context is very multidimensional. I think it's about looking ahead rather than sort of like, oh, what is everyone else doing, right? It's not reactive. It's sort of like being proactive. And once you start seeing that more and more people are hopping on the bandwagon, it's almost like it becomes a cost of not complying rather than the cost of complying, right? It becomes a competitive disadvantage rather than what are we going to get out of it if we get certified, right? So it's a very, like I said, it's a very different place of looking at this program and having the discussions internally around it.
Practically speaking, I think it's important to understand the regulatory support behind this, and we should maybe talk a little bit later about which countries recognize this as an official transfer mechanism. But just to close off on the benefits and why organizations should do this, I'd be interested to hear what benefits you've seen in practice, the organizations that you've been involved in. What advantages are there in practice to these certifications?
So, I mean, again, right, I mean, not trying to sugarcoat it, but if a regulator has endorsed and is a participant, sometimes even sort of at the helm of a program such as this, and I can mention, for example, Singapore is, the deputy chair of the forum, right, with the US being the chair. Let's say I was an organization that had, an establishment in Singapore, or certainly had set up in Singapore, and I was considering how to enhance my compliance posture vis-a-vis regulators that I am certainly, I have to report to, and and especially in certain regulated sectors, it really helps to have that sort of stamp of approval, or that sort of, the branding of trustworthiness. And I actually think that the global CBPR is very, very, it makes a lot of sense to certainly consider getting certification under this program in Singapore, right? But of course, I think the other sort of what I'm seeing right on the ground as well, right, Danie, and maybe now's a good segue to talk about the constraints of alternatives, because we always are weighing up different options, right? As businesses always weigh up different options, right? It's like, okay, number one, yes, there is this option to get certification, but the question is, right? Of course, it's going to cost us XYZ, right? Versus status quo. What is status quo? So I'll tell you about the pain points that we have experienced, vis-a-vis our clients, where they are telling us how things are not, something's got to give, right? And it's like right now, what we're looking at is number one, right? So several mechanisms with regards to transfer mechanisms that we're seeing globally. Number one, adequacy. I mean, we're in a very, very polarized world as we speak at the moment. I'm not sure it's going to get any better. We don't know. There's a big question mark as to the way things are headed, right? So when you talk about something like adequacy, the truth is there is not a lot of control that organizations have around how governments deem, a recipient jurisdiction as adequate or not. And some laws don't even provide for adequacy, right? I mean, like, for example, Singapore, we don't. We don't even have that sort of empowering kind of mechanism where governments can say, all right, either we adopt a white list or a black list, or, some sort of adequacy decision to then say, let's say South Africa is adequate, right? I mean, there isn't even that option, right? So there's a patchwork and there are disparities, and businesses don't like fragmentation, because it's like, if you want to do it streamlined way, right? You want to transfer data in a streamlined way, that is not a solution. Number two, SCCs, and I say this with a bit of a raised eyebrow because, I mean, as the term goes, standard contractual clauses. Now, I am in the business of SCCs and, DTAs and DPAs and IGTTAs and all these acronyms. And what are they? Essentially contracts, right? Binding corporate rules sometimes also get parked under this pool. But again, they become extremely unwieldy with how things are going, because you have different standard contractual clauses. You have a version, in Europe, you have a version in China, you have model contractual clauses, which are voluntary in ASEAN, which is Southeast Asia. You have the Ibero-American kind of RFID type, framework as well. And then you have the interoperability guides. Exactly. Brazil, etc., etc. And so what you have is a couple of hundred of pages of legalese and legal provisions that frankly only the lawyers understand. So how is that operational? How is that pragmatic, right? Like, in terms of if you're going to implement these SCCs, the truth is it's a scary document. It's overly legalistic and technical, and people, that are actually, having to implement these rules half the time don't really know what's been signed. And when you're talking about a global business with different offices, you have this very unwieldy document that is signed and filed. And, it's kind of like kept in the record. Sometimes you have to register with authorities, which you do in local language. But the truth is, nobody really understands how to operationalize it. Now, I don't think it's very sustainable or forward-looking, right? This whole document. The third option would be kind of bilateral regional initiatives. Again, there's a constraint there, because unlike the global CDPR, it's limited by geography. So we have the ASEAN MCCs I talked about earlier, we have the China SCCs, and now there are these Greater Bay Area initiatives, right? So China, Hong Kong, etc., that whole Greater Bay Area. European Union has its own sort of framework, obviously, with regards to EU, right, member states. But like I said, right, this is again, only sort of either regional or cross-regional or bilateral So the scope, right, and the sort of scalability is not as, in a way, right? I mean, it's not as ideal as something like the global forum, and everything that underpins it.
I really liked the way you talked about, I mean, the SCCs. I mean, I think we all in this space have pain points around that. But one of the points I really appreciated you bringing out is businesses don't understand what they've agreed to. And I think that is one of the scariest things about the SECs. They're not negotiable. And so often what happens is legal says, sorry, guys, we just got to sign these. They're non-negotiable. And so the business says, okay. And then suddenly they've agreed to like very specific things that, as you say, people don't understand. And I think sometimes when you're pitching this internally, the benefit of the CBPR, the scariness is, oh, but we're going to have to answer all these questions. We're going to be audited. Like, what if our privacy program isn't good? And I think the rebuttal to that is we've already contractually agreed to this in the SCCs. Most of the stuff in here, we've already said we're doing or will do. And, we're not doing it. And I think sometimes the threat of regulatory enforcement or action, as you pointed out, Charmian, it depends on the industry. It depends on what you're doing, your relationship, whether you think you are even in the crosshairs or, just like completely in another space. But the threat of breach of contract is something everybody can understand. And so I think that's also something that is a fair point. You've signed this 300-page document, and do you know what you've agreed to when it comes to security measures, data breach, handling of data, using data for your own purposes? A lot of American companies think they can train models or use data in their own way, even though they're a processor. There's all sorts of little subtle things that I think, or not so subtle, that you are scary about signing SCCs without fully understanding them.
I totally agree, and being a regulatory lawyer, right, that advises global corporations, actually, what we see is that the risk of non-compliance, of infringements, of sanctions, etc., following a regulatory kind of investigation or incident is always because of the practical operationalization, implementation of what you say on paper. So compliance, accountability, governance is no longer just a written exercise where lawyer to lawyer, we sign a contract, done, signed, sealed, delivered, and actually there's no follow-up, right? I mean, the people who actually have to operationalize what's agreed upon in the contract don't have any clue what's been signed, so you have two aspects, right? One is potential breach of contract because basically there is some sort of broken telephone or some sort of like loss in translation. Lawyers agree on something, but it doesn't get translated into the practical operationalization and implementation of what is on the contract. And number two, the actual when you actually do an audit versus just signing on something, there is an actual distinction because you're actually much more inclusive. It's a multi-stakeholder process, right? When you actually get an assessment done, right, with the accountability agent, and sometimes you have an assessment body. There are different ways that the different states actually structure it. For example, in Singapore, the accountability agent is the authority, which is why I said it actually lends a lot of firepower to why we think this could take off in a big way, because literally IMDA is the accountability agent, and then you have external assessment bodies, right, endorsed by the authority. But either way, you're involving everybody on the ground, your risk folks, your legal people, it's not just a sort of desktop agreement slash review slash whatever you want to call it, drafting exercise, right? You actually have to get the into the trenches. You have to speak to the people who are going to be, you get to interview them and et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is actually much more inclusive and much more multi-party. And so I think that is actually how compliance programs should be built, and actually how data transfer should be viewed, right? Not as a paper exercise that is once and done, because the truth is you need to speak to the people who are actually accessing the data. That's actually, you know what I mean? Um, yeah, and so I actually think that, whilst SECs keep, me with a job and sort of busy with, but I've seen these unwieldy annexes. I can tell you hand over heart that half the time nobody knows what goes into them. Nobody follows up. And I mean, it's great when it's signed, people just heave a sigh of relief, but actually that's when things can go wrong. Yeah. And I've seen it once too often.
I really like that you mentioned the magic in the word accountability agent, and I think that really is true, because this program helps you to show that you are compliant. It's not just SCCs that you sign. You have to back this up with proof, basically, especially for the PRP assessments, where you basically a processor. There's a deep dive that happens. You can't just say it's all okay. You need to show that it's all okay. Something else I'd like to touch on, you've mentioned that from a regulatory perspective, there are reasons to get certified. I heard someone mention the other day from a litigation perspective, there's also a benefit, and in many countries you get these opportunistic plaintiffs, and I've heard this view that an opportunistic plaintiff might be less keen on taking on an organization if they see that they are CBPR certified versus another one. So you're not going to just file a class action claim if you see this organization is CBPR certified, because if they are certified, their house is probably in order. So you might just move on to the next target. So there is this deterrent, I think, from that perspective, but there's also an attraction for some organizations, because if you want to use a processor, so like a cloud service provider, for example, and they are PRP certified, it's going to be much easier to onboard them. You're going to have to do much less due diligence because they've already gone through this process. So a big benefit for any organization that has corporate customers, it's a big advantage if you can show this certification, because the other organization will feel much better about using you versus another organization that might not be certified.
I completely agree, Danie. And actually, but just to add on, right, because I want to kind of clear the misconception. People think, yes, it's great. I mean, there's no silver bullet option, but it does give a kind of like, in a way, a shield, or it certainly enhances the compliance posture of companies. But I would also add that it is not just for the ones with deep pockets. So one thing that I really like about the CBPR is that, much as people may misunderstand that, because it's not cheap, so only the the big companies will consider getting compliant, getting certification. My apologies. And also because they have different kind of like offices across the globe. Actually, I feel like it actually is a great opportunity to level the playing field as well with the certification scheme. It all comes down to how the regulators actually implement it. So, for example, in Singapore, I think that there are actually incentives, and there are like subsidies, etc., or and certainly I can tell you, because I have advice in this particular jurisdiction for some time now. I know how the regulatory thinking is behind it. It absolutely is. It rings true. What you've said, Danie. Like, if you have the CBPR, stamp, um, just in so many ways, so many ways. So I agree, the bad actors, maybe, all right, let's go somewhere else. The opportunistic, like you say, plaintiff the bar, let's go somewhere else. Regulator, we're not going to hit them so hard with a stick, right? Because look, they actually bothered to get certification. Like, it's not like they're not trying, they're actually doing their homework. And so I think that actually on so many fronts, you actually get that sort of, competitive advantage. I also wanted to talk about AI, right? So we talk about all these use cases for AI right now. And for example, right, one of the big use cases is in the life sciences and healthcare industry, right? Which I understand you support, and I also do a lot of work in that space. But actually, what's happening is that they have huge, huge use cases for AI. Huge. I mean, the benefits of using AI outweigh, right? I mean, we want to say we want to find a way to allow AI to enhance outcomes, health outcomes, healthcare outcomes, better patient outcomes, whatever it might be, right? There's so many use cases in that sector. Now, the problem is, or not say the problem, but the challenge they sometimes face is that they tend to deal with very sensitive data. The truth is that, when you're looking at, a medical device company, life sciences company, research company that supports medical, distributor, whatever, they tend to handle data sets that could be potentially quite sensitive. Now, so what do they do, right? So huge use cases for AI sensitive data, right? It clashes. So I actually think this is the beauty of something like the certification scheme, because what you are doing is that you have, again, transfers of data imperative, because when you use AI, it's all about the quality of the data. Large data sets means better quality data, better outcomes, more accurate outcomes, right? So you unlock the benefits of having large data sets through trusted data flows. And trusted data flows, again, to your point, Danie, is like, how do you prove that your data flows are trusted? I can't think of a better way than certification, truly. And also, it's cost effective if you think about it for all the sort of data sets you want to allot, right? And by the way, like I said, you have to have diverse data sets for the outcomes to be accurate. It's part of the data quality. You need diversity for it to be more accurate. So the truth is, again, the global remit, I again think that the CBPR, if, we really are headed in the right direction, could again be the solution, or one very good solution to what we're facing now with regards to kind of all the issues around data, sort of, the fact that you've got all these disparate kind of frameworks, etc., around data. I know that there are challenges still with sort of national security, data localization, data sovereignty, all of that. But again, like I said, you don't need to hit 100% if you can hit a vast majority of the globe with that level of diversity, with that kind of scalability. I do think it's good enough. And so I know it sounds kind of idealistic sometimes, but I'm thinking kind of macroscopic trends as well. And I just think that I'm hard pressed to find a better kind of alternative given everything we have spoken about.
I think that's a great transition to kind of the future, right, of this certification. I mean, as you were talking, I was, daydreaming about a future in which, you get an RFP response, and the RFP response is like, are you, ISO 27001 certified? You say yes, and then you don't have to answer a whole bunch of questions. It'll say, are you CBPR certified? So yes, you don't have to answer a whole bunch. I mean, that would be amazing, right? I think every company listening to this would be like, sign me up. But let's talk a little bit more about the future, right? The global word. You were talking about the benefit of the choice of the word accountability agent. You've mentioned Boracay a couple times, Charmian. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the future that you see, the trends you see, some of the things people were talking about, and where we think this will be or where it's going?
I actually think that there will be more members and associate members, and we will see this happen quite quickly. And I think it's been accelerated with everything that we've spoken about, including AI, and the fact that a lot of nations now are like, embracing, and businesses as well, embracing, the promise of, things like agentic AI and who knows what's next, quantum, etc. But basically, technology is moving at such a breakneck speed that actually regulations have to keep up, digital regulations. And part of that is obviously data, right? Because data is the fuel and the lifeblood of the development and deployment of these technologies. Now, so, I mean, coming back to your question, Kellie, what did I observe in Boracay? Well, I observed that there was very strong commitment by the authorities, by the ecosystem. We saw guests, guests that were not currently members, no associate members, but is a very strong signal that they're clearly looking into considering, right, or at least assessing and analyzing whether they want to join as either full member or associate member. So, I mean, I can't, don't quote me on this, but and I can't speak on behalf of any kind of governments or whatever, but I sense that, so we have South Africa being, in the process of becoming a full member. Malaysia might be applying for associate membership. I think just kind of looking at trend lines, places like Brazil, Kenya, Peru, Thailand, right? I actually attended just days ago a very interesting remote session of between the Thailand PDPC, the commission, and Singapore's Data Privacy Commission. And they were talking about cross-border data transfers, and the global CBPR was also mentioned a couple of times in that session. Okay, so again, right, following trend lines and kind of like signaling, Abu Dhabi, Saudi, etc. So I really think that we circle the globe and we can actually easily pick up, at least one or two potential or prospective members. And I think this, once we get enough momentum, I think that will become a trend, which is great, which is promising.
That's so exciting to hear. I think for many organizations, initially it was just something somewhere in a corner of the world. Not that APEC is a small corner, but now it is global. And I think there's this expression, if you build it, they will come. And that's what's happening now. A lot of companies or a lot of countries are now joining, and all the others still feel like they're missing out. So they want to join the party too. So let's hope that there will be an acceleration of countries joining and formal recognition. I just wanted to touch on that briefly. So there are some countries, from what I understand, that do recognize transfers based on CBPR certification. So Japan is one, and I think Dubai is another one, where if you transfer information to an organization that is certified in one of those, and if you're in one of those countries and you're transferring to someone that's certified, that will be seen as adequate. Am I right on that?
That's right. And in fact, it goes even further with DIFC, where it's so entrenched and so intertwined with how you actually do compliance with their requirements, right, locally. Singapore also recognizes it. I think currently it says APEC CBPR, but obviously that needs to be updated. CBPR. But basically what it says in our PDPA, or Personal Data Protection Act, is that if you are CBPR certified, you are deemed or considered, right, construed to have complied with what we call our transfer limitation obligation, which is under Section 26 of our Act. So I think more and more regulators will follow the sort of adoption of CBPR into their statutes, into their rules, into their guidance, etc. And again, right, I mean, once you have that sort of level of endorsement, I really think that it's going to be an upward trend. The other thing I would like to mention, which I haven't mentioned just yet, is around kind of cooperation between different regulators as part of the forum. Is what they call the Global CAPE, CAPE. So it's a cooperation scheme. It's kind of like MLAT, right? So Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, where, but it will be global, right? So a multilateral treaty. And by the way, it's voluntary. So a good example I might cite is, let's say South Africa is a member, and so is Singapore. And let's say there was some sort of law enforcement or some sort of regulatory investigation involving a company that straddles South Africa and Singapore, amongst others. What Singapore could do is we would write to the South African authorities and say, hey, we're conducting this investigation. We need some information to be provided to assist and to aid in our investigation. And South Africa is at its, kind of prerogative, again, voluntary, that's not compelled, could certainly address that or respond to that request. And so there is that sort of mutual sharing of information between regulatory bodies under the forum. And I think this really changes the landscape as well, tremendously. And again, I mean, once you wield that kind of like cross, regulatory, kind of like, powers and authorities, and functions, I think that's when it really catches the kind of like regulatory spotlight, where, businesses will sit up and go, what's this forum? We need to get to the bottom of it. And, and I think that then there's also a bit more of an impetus, incentive, motivation, catalyst to want to get certification.
I think that's excellent. I think that's a great sort of like ending optimistic forward trend point. And I do want to say, is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you wanted to say, Charmian, on this topic? Is there any other misconceptions or selling points or anything that we didn't get to that you think we should really kind of try to cram in?
I think like the truth is that sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the noise, that everything is so fragmented, disparate. You throw geopolitics in the mix, sometimes the socioeconomic kind of challenges, and it's just like the world seems like a very scary and dangerous place to operate in. And then on top of that, you get these, sometimes, right, the headlines just always tell you about sort of, all the scary sanctions, the regulatory, investigations, the kind of yeah, like, but actually the truth is that a lot of there are a lot of similarities, right, in what we're looking at. So actually, something like this unified framework actually brings us back into like sort of first principles and sort of like by OECD sort of principles around why are we even talking about data protection, why does it matter, and sort of like coming back to basics on accountability, on compliance, on standards, right? So apart from sort of like what I said earlier about coming back to our why, it's also giving us a kind of like a sort of encouraging sort of like reminder that actually the world is a lot more, there's a lot more commonalities that than sometimes we may perceive. And so I think this is, coming to a global CBPR forum, you are again reminded that actually it's almost like coming back to fundamental principles, which is the baseline layer of frameworks and regulations and laws and all that. So it's the principles, right? That we build upon, and actually there's a lot of common ground that we could work from. So I feel like philosophically as well. I mean, just ending on a philosophical note. Actually, I feel like this is a great kind of forum to, in a way, distill everything, remind us that the world is more interconnected, intertwined, interdependent than sometimes what we see or we perceive out there.
It's such a great summary, and I like the reference to the OECD principles, which if you are reasonably new to privacy, I encourage you to go check out. That's a deep cut, foundational. I think it was from the 1980s, right? In some ways, we've just been a whole messy cycle, and then come back to, as you say, foundational principles. Not so complicated after all. And I also love the tie-in to the very first point about starting out. We start out in law and everything is, we're anxious, right? We're the anxious lawyer at the beginning of our career. And, it's going to, just take a broader perspective and go back to first principles, and we can handle this. So I kind of like that tie-in as well.
Exactly.
Thanks so much, Charmian. It's been a really
Thank you.
insightful, useful discussion. I hope our listeners managed to get something useful out of this and look at this in a positive light. It's nice to sometimes just hear about solutions instead of problems. Thanks for sharing your experience and your insights with us. We really appreciate it.
Likewise, it was so good to speak, Danie and Kellie.
Thanks again, Charmian. This was great.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of Privacy in Practice, brought to you by VeraSafe. We hope today's insights help you navigate privacy challenges with confidence and clarity.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. And we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, or suggestions for future topics. Send us an email to podcast@verasafe.com.
And to learn more about VeraSafe's data protection and privacy services, you can visit us at verasafe.com.
Until next time, best of luck in approaching your privacy challenges in a practical way.
See you then.